me the story of Jesus, right from my heart every word. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard. Love in that story so tender, clearer than ever I see. Say, let me read while you whisper, love paid the ransom for me. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard.
Okay, this week we're going to continue with our study of Elijah the prophet. We're up to number 6, and we're just really making headway. We've spent 2 weeks on one verse, I think, the last couple of weeks, but we're going to cover quite a few today. So we are at 1 Kings chapter 17 and verse 8, and we're going to try to get down through this passage that goes through verse 16. I don't know that we'll get there today. We may or may not. Depends on how much chasing I want to do. But 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 8. Now you remember, we had Elijah. First he was sent to Ahab. Then from Ahab he was sent to the brook Kerith. He spent about a year there being fed by ravens. It had water in the brook, and then when the brook dried up, then God sent him to the woman in Zarephath, the widow woman of Zidon. Last week he got to town and found the widow woman, and came to the realization that she was not the wealthiest woman in town. She was down to her last meal. And so we were left there with that revelation last week, and that's where we pick up today. And so in 1 Kings 17, verse 8, it says, And the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, Arise, get thee to Zarephath, which belongeth to Zidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow woman there to sustain thee. And we covered this verse in depth last week, or in fact over the last 2 weeks we've covered this verse. So I'll have you refer back to those lessons rather than spend the time here today. Verse 10, So he arose and went to Zarephath. And we commented on this last week, how Elijah simply obeyed the commandment. He didn't argue with him, he just did it. He just went. As soon as it was given, he didn't ask questions, he just did what he was told. He arose and went, and when he came to the gate of the city, behold, the widow woman, not a widow, the widow, the very one that God had sent him to. The widow woman was there gathering of sticks, and he called to her and said, Fetch me, I pray thee, a little water in a vessel that I may drink. And I pointed out last week how that on the one hand he was probably thirsty. The guy just walked 100 miles, he probably could use something to drink, but there's another reason for this. And part of that reason was a test. Many times this is a way that people have tested to see is this actually the woman? Is this the woman, or could it be somebody else? See, I mean, I'm sure that when he got there, she didn't have a neon sign over her head pointing, this widow. The town might have had a lot of widows in it. How do I know if this is the right one or not? So part of this was a test to see if she would be agreeable to fetch a stranger a glass of water during a time of drought when water was a very precious commodity. Is this the person that God sent me to, or do I seek another? In other words. And I want you to notice that what he said, he called to her and says, Fetch me, I pray thee, a little water in a vessel that I may drink. And as she was going forth to fetch it, she just immediately dropped her sticks and went to get the water. This is one of the ways that he could know that this was in fact the woman. I told this story. I want you to turn to Genesis chapter 24. I told this story, and I don't know if I can get through it now. I told this story before I was your pastor, when I was down on one of the traveling trips, and Wendy wasn't in the room, and so it was easier to tell the story when she wasn't standing there, when she wasn't in the room glaring at me. But I have already shared with you how that on the night that we were to be wed, I spent most of the time on my route praying that if this is the woman I'm supposed to marry, you got to get me home. And I'm not going to go into all, it would take me an hour to tell the whole story, but this is funny. But Wendy works with chaplains. I'm going to segue here for a second, but yesterday she was talking about how they had gone out to visit some people that were in the hospice, and the chaplain was there, and she was saying that this guy, I mean, he just talks and talks and talks and talks. And I said, Wendy, wasn't he a Southern Baptist preacher? She said, yeah. I said, you ever met a Baptist preacher that didn't talk and talk and talk and talk? It's kind of one of those traits. We do that a lot. Anyway, there were a multitude of things that could have gotten in the way to keep me from getting home in time on that Friday night to be at the chapel on time. In fact, if I got home on time, it would have been a miracle. During the middle of the winter, crossing Donner Summit, when it can snow at a moment's notice and shut the road down, with all that could have happened on that January 9th Friday evening, God could have kept me away from home like that. And guess what? I got home earlier than I'd ever gotten home in my life, which told me, okay, she's the one I'm supposed to marry. Okay? And so I did I married her before she changed her mind. Okay? Well, now in Genesis chapter 24, we have the story of Abraham's servant, one of Abraham's servants, that Abraham wanted a wife for Isaac, but he didn't want a wife of the Canaanites. He wanted him to go back to the old country, so to speak, and fetch a wife for him from the old country. Okay, I don't know, maybe Abraham was an Italian. It sounds like that, but no, he sent him back to his own people to find a wife. And he sends this servant back there. And in Genesis chapter 24 and verse 12, we have the servant who says, and he said, O Lord God of my master Abraham, I pray thee, send me good speed this day, and show kindness unto my master Abraham. Behold, I stand here by the well of water, and the daughters of the men of the city come out to draw water. And let it come to pass that the damsel to whom I shall say, let down thy pitcher, I pray thee, that I may drink, and she shall say, drink, and I will give thy camels drink also. Let the same be she that thou hast appointed for thy servant Isaac. And thereby shall I know that thou hast shown kindness unto my master. You see that? You see how he did that? This is biblical. There's nothing wrong with doing this. If your heart's in the right place and you're searching for God's answer to a question that you have in your life, if it's a reasonable thing, you can ask and he'll answer. He will answer. I'm sure, I'm not going to go into detail on this either, but you can't imagine the amount of time I spent on my knees relative to this church. And I knew, depending on what the vote was going to be last December, what my answer would be. I knew it before we ever walked in the room. I knew what that number had to be. So this is done. And there's nothing wrong with it. If you have a question like this, you can ask God. Just, I wouldn't ask him on something frivolous like who's going to win the Super Bowl game, because I don't think he much cares one way or the other. But when it comes to something important in your life, who you're going to marry, things like that, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Abraham sent his servant, and that's what his servant did. Okay? Verse 15, and it came to pass, before he had done speaking, that behold, Rebekah came out, who was born to Bethuel, son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, with her pitcher upon her shoulder. And the damsel was fair to look upon, a virgin, neither had any man known her. I need to make a comment here. A month or so ago, we talked about the fact that in the Old Testament, many times when it talks about a man knowing a woman, that is in a sexual sense. Adam knew his wife and she conceived. We've looked at some of those verses. Here's a case where this woman was a virgin and neither had any man known her. That tends to make me think that you can get in trouble sexually without going all the way. That tends to make me think that a man can know a woman without causing her to no longer be a virgin. And I will let you deal with the rest of it. In other words, it's not just that act that is considered fornication. You don't have to go that far in order for it to be considered fornication. We have, I won't mention names, but we have a member here, when I was preaching on marriage one time in the studies, asked the question of, where do you draw the line? How do you determine where that line is? And my answer to him was, what would your wife think? At what point would your wife have decided that you cheated on her? Well, it would have been a whole lot before you got that far, right? So that's what I'm and I'll let you guys deal with the rest of it, but I think there's a point at which you've crossed the line far before you've gone all the way. Okay? But then I'm just an old fuddy-duddy. And the damsel was very fair to look upon, a virgin, neither had any man known her. And she went down to the well and filled her pitcher and came up, and the servant ran to meet her and said, Let me, I pray thee, drink a little water of thy pitcher. And she said, Drink, my lord. And she hastened and set down her pitcher upon her hand and gave him drink. And when she had done giving him drink, she said, I will draw water for thy camels also until they have done drinking. Guess what? Is this the one? Is this the one? He just finished praying to God that this would happen, that he would find the wife for Isaac, and before he even got finished, she showed up and sure looks like she meets the test. And ran again to the well of water and drew for all his camels, and the man, wondering at her, held his peace to wit whether the Lord had made his journey prosperous or not. And it came to pass, as the camels had done drinking, that the man took a golden earring of 1/2 shekel weight and 2 bracelets for her hands of 10 shekels weight of gold, and said, Whose daughter art thou? Tell me, I pray thee, is there room in thy father's house for us to lodge in? And she said unto him, I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, which she bare unto Nahor. She said moreover unto him, We have both straw and provender enough and room to lodge in. And the man bowed down his head. Notice this. Bowed down his head and worshiped the Lord. Just like I said earlier in the introduction to this. Bowed down his head and worshiped the Lord, and he said, Blessed be the Lord God of my master Abraham, who hath not left destitute my master of his mercy and his truth, I being in the way the Lord led me to the house of my master's brethren. God led him right to the place he was supposed to go. So Elijah is testing this. Is this the woman? Is this her? So he asked her to fetch him a little water. 1 Kings 17:11. And as she was going to fetch it, he called to her and said, Bring me, I pray thee, a morsel of bread in thine hand. And as I pointed out, he was probably hungry. But again, this is another test. This is a more severe test. And she said, As the Lord thy God liveth, I have not a cake, but a handful of meal in a barrel, and a little oil in a cruse, and behold, I'm gathering 2 sticks, that I may go in and dress it for me and my son, that we may eat it and die. And this is where we left off last week. She's down to the last handful of food that she's got and a little bit of oil in a cruse. And there's a couple of things I want to point out before we really start to get any farther in this. Notice that this woman says, "As the Lord thy God liveth." Remember, this woman wasn't a Jew. This woman was from Zidon. And yet she recognized, as most people in that part of the world did, that the God of the Hebrews was the true God. They were scared to death of that God. The people surrounding Israel were more afraid of that God than the Israelites were themselves. That was one of the problems with the nation of Israel. They'd lost the fear of the Lord. But the people around him were scared to death of him. They'd seen what he'd done to Egypt. They'd heard the stories. They knew about Jericho. They knew about the miracles. They knew that that God that you're bringing in here can cause problems. "As the Lord thy God liveth." She recognized that the Lord God of the Hebrews was the true God. And she also recognized that he lived. She was a better theologian than King Ahab was. Ahab had written him off for dead, or said he didn't exist. Here, the king of Israel, but this woman, this Gentile woman, believed that the God of Hebrews was the true God, and that this God of the Hebrews was living, was alive. Now, I'll have more to say about that as we move on. But notice that, "As the Lord thy God," not Lord my God. I mean, the people in this area, they worship Baal, so it wasn't hers. "As the Lord thy God liveth," your God, the Hebrew God. So we need to understand that from that standpoint. And she says here in 1 Kings 17:12, "As the Lord thy God liveth, I have not a cake, but a handful of meal in a barrel, and a little oil in a cruse. And behold, I am gathering 2 sticks, that I may go in and dress it for me and my son, that we may eat it and die." And Elijah said unto her, "Fear not, go and do as thou hast said, but make me thereof a little cake first, and bring it unto me, and after make for thee and for thy son." What? What? Make me a little cake? What? Really? I got enough food for me and my son, and you want me to pay you first? That's kind of an arrogant thing to say, don't you think? That's kind of extreme. And it would be extreme. I mean, this sounds like a TV preacher, but it would be extreme if it weren't for what follows in verse 14. If you cut it off right there, yeah, it sounds extreme, but I want you to see what it says in verse 14. "For thus saith the Lord God of Israel, the barrel of meal shall not waste, neither shall the cruse of oil fail, until the day that the Lord sendeth rain upon the earth." Does this sound familiar? There's a verse over in Matthew that I've referred to several times during the course of this study. In Matthew chapter 6 and verse 33, it says, "But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you." So Elijah says, "Make me a little cake first, and the barrel won't waste." You see, this is one of God's provisions. This is one of God's commandments. This is one of God's teachings. And this is one of the conditions upon the barrel not wasting. This is a very extreme test of anybody. I mean, we don't have sacrifices now in the sense that we had them in the Old Testament, where you bring your sheep and kill animals and that kind of. We don't have those types of sacrifices. The sacrifices that we have in the New Testament, one of them is to make yourself, to present yourself before the Lord in his house. That's one of them. Come to church. That's one of the sacrifices. That's not really that hard, is it? To get up on a Sunday morning and take a shower and put on some clothes and go listen to me talk well, that might be hard, but showing up in church isn't all that hard. You just got to put up with me for an hour and 15 minutes or so. You know, yeah, it's a sacrifice, but it's not a huge sacrifice. Okay? We have other sacrifices. Live a godly life. Is that really that bad? Is that really that rough? I mean, think about the things that we're supposed to do in the Bible. Not steal, not be a drunk, not cheat on your wife, not that kind of, well, all that does is make you a better person. When you stop and think about it, those are all things that we have laws against anyway. So it's not like that sacrifice is all that horrendous. But this is the one that causes people a lot of problems. This is one of the ones that Wendy and I had a huge issue with. A gigantic issue with this one. Because we always lived right at the line. For a long time, we were right there at the, we had, okay, well, if we make $3,000 this month, $3,200's got to go out. And now we join the church and we got to take 10% off that $3,000 and put it, how are we going to do this? How can we afford to do it? We barely have enough to get by as it is, just like this woman. This woman had enough for one meal, and now the prophet shows up and wants some of it first. That's a sacrifice. And remember when I took the job as your pastor, I told you I may not tell you everything that you should do, but I can tell you what not to, that I know where the holes are that you don't want to step in. This is a sinkhole, folks. This is the sinkhole that swallowed Scott Lake. This is and I'm going to show you the verses here in a second. This is one that God commands that we do, and if we don't do it, we suffer as a result of it. I cannot tell you the number of times that Wendy and I worried about how are we going to pay these bills, and we would hold back on bringing our money to the church, and more bills would show up. And when we finally learned the lesson, those bills never came anymore, and we were able to right ourselves. It didn't matter if we went through Dave Ramsey's book and studied, which we did, and before him Larry Burkett, and before him everybody else. And it didn't matter if we had it right down to the penny. We always ended up needing more pennies at the end of the month until we learned this lesson. It's that important of a lesson. Okay? So I'm just trying to tell everybody, don't step in this hole. In fact, Dave Ramsey, if you look at Dave Ramsey's book, in the back of his book, there's a chart that tells you how much you're supposed to budget for this and how much you're supposed to, where your budget should be. And the first line is income, obviously, and the first expense is listed as charity or gifts. Well, that's church. That's church. And it says you're supposed to give 10 to 15%. And Larry Burkett says the same thing. The book, The Richest Man in Babylon, says the same thing. That book, I can give you the whole book in a nutshell. The first 10% goes to God. The second 10% goes into long-term savings. You live off the balance. And if you can learn to live off 70 to 80% of what you make, and make sure and give God His 10% and put that 10% in you will amass a fortune over the course of a lifetime. My father was a guy that saved like you wouldn't believe. He lived off, I think, 60% of what he made. And he started doing that when he barely made minimum wage. And when he finally retired and was very, very high on the ladder, he had amassed a fortune that my mother was able to live on. My father died in 1993. My mother passed away in 2008. She retired 3 or 4 years before my dad passed away. My dad had a stroke. She had to take care of him for all those years and pay all the medical bills that were associated with that without working. And then she lived for the rest of her life without ever having to lift a penny, without ever having to work at all off of the money that my dad put away by following that simple rule. But you know one thing my dad always did? 10% always went to God. And 10% always went to long-term savings. And he lived off the difference. Okay? Now I want you to turn to Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 9. I want to show this to you. I really want you to see it. Because this is the way out. In this country right now, we have, I think the number is 80%. 80% of the people in this country, or well, between 73 and 80%, depending on what poll you want to listen to, claim that they're Christians. Okay? And yet we have a 50% divorce rate in the country. That means 50% of those marriages end in divorce. And 80% of the marriages that end in divorce in this country, the reason for it is financial problems. That's the reason they end in divorce. It's not because the husband or the wife is cheating on the... No, it goes back to finances. That's the reason that we have divorces in this country. That's the primary reason. And then when you survey those folks and you ask them this question, have you been putting back the money for God? No. By and large, no, we haven't. And they wonder why they have financial problems. Okay? In Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 9, it says, honor the Lord with thy substance, that word means wealth, and with the first fruits of all thine increase. That word increase translates a word that means product or revenue. In other words, income. And look at the promise after that. So shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine. Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added unto you. Make for me first a little cake, and the barrel won't fail, and the oil won't go away. That's the rule, that's the condition. You follow this teaching, and you won't have the problems that so many have. Turn to Genesis chapter 14 and verse 18. Because I know there's a lot of people that will say, well, that whole tithing thing, that's law. That's the law of Moses. And we don't live under the law anymore. I want to show you this doesn't have anything to do with the law. It has absolutely nothing to do with the law. Turn first to Genesis chapter 14 and verse 18, where we read, this is dealing with Abraham. And Melchizedek, teeth slipped on me there for a minute, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him, talking about Abraham, and said, blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand, and he, that's Abram, gave him tithes of all. That word tithes translates a word that means the 10th part. That's where the 10% thing comes from. When Conrad and I talk about your 10% money, that's where that comes from. He gave him tithes of all, 10%. Look also over in Genesis chapter 28. I remember when I was ordained, Conrad made the point that Wendy was not a co-pastor, but she was my helpmeet. Right? She was here to help me out. She pointed this verse out to me, so I'm going to give credit where credit's due. Genesis chapter 28, we're going to start at verse 11. She's going through the Bible, you know, where you read the Bible through the year, and you read and it just so happened she read this verse the other day, or this passage. Well, let's look at verse 10. Genesis 28:10. And Jacob went out from Beersheba and went towards Haran, and he lighted upon a certain place and tarried there all night because the sun was set. And he took of the stones of that place and put them for his pillows and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and interesting, you're going to see what this place is in a little while. This was Bethel. You remember when Abraham, you remember in the beginning of this study on Sodom and Gomorrah, we talked about how Bethel was on the west and Hai was on the east, and there was an altar built there by Abraham, right? You remember that? Well, Jacob comes along, Abraham's grandson, and picks up some of the stones that were just happened to be on that altar and used one of them as a pillow. Well, that was the stones that Abraham had set on the altar to sacrifice to the Most High God. No wonder he had a bad dream. Just a little side note there. So he takes one of them and puts it for his pillow, and he dreamed. And behold, a ladder set up upon the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham, thy father, and the God of Isaac. The land whereon thou liest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed. And thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and thou shalt spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south, and in thee and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And behold, I am with thee, and I will keep thee in all places whither thou goest, and I will bring thee again into this land, for I will not leave thee until I have done that which I have spoken to thee of. And Jacob awakened out of his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I knew it not. And he was afraid and said, how dreadful is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. Think about that. The house of God is the gate of heaven. I bet you didn't think that when you walked in the door this morning, did you? The house of God is the gate of heaven. How dreadful is this place? This is not the place to make fun of God. And Jacob rose up early in the morning and took the stone that he had put for his pillow and set it for a pillar and poured oil upon the top of it. And he called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of that city was called Luz at the first. And Jacob vowed a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God, and this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the 10th unto thee. That's where that comes from. You say, well, that's Old Testament law. No, that's not Old Testament law. It's Abraham and Jacob. The law didn't come until Moses, 400 and some years later. This isn't law. This is God's teaching. This is God's provision for His church. This is how He pays for His church. In Exodus chapter 22 and verse 28, it says, thou shalt not revile the gods, nor curse the ruler of thy people. Thou shalt not delay to offer the first of thy ripe fruits, and of thy liquors the firstborn of thy sons shalt thou give unto me. And that word first, we're going to get to that one in just a second. Over in Ezekiel chapter 44 and verse 30, I'll give you a second to flip over there. Ezekiel 44:30. That's right after the book of Daniel. Is it Ezekiel? No, it's right before the book of Daniel. It's in the major prophets. Ezekiel 44:30, where it says, and the first of all your first fruits. That word first comes from a word that means the choicest, the best of your first fruit. You think about this. When you brought your offering, when you brought your lamb to the temple, you didn't bring him a spotted one that was diseased. He wanted the best. God demands and deserves the best. The best you've got, that's what you bring to the house of God. That's why me and Conrad and Ben and all the other ministers show up wearing a coat and tie to church. Now, I don't expect every man in this church to do so, but you're not going to see a man stand in this pulpit that isn't wearing that, because God demands the best. That's why you will always see Wendy or Mary Dell or Linda or any of the other women that are pastors' wives wearing a dress, because God demands the best. You bring your best to church. You know, I'm going to chase a rabbit here. For centuries, people dressed up to go to church. My grandfather had one suit, and he only wore it one place other than when they put him in his casket and lowered him into the ground. And that was when he went to church. He was a farmer. He didn't wear suits, but he had one. And he wore it for 40 years, and he wore it to church. You've heard the old saying of, putting on your Sunday best or Sunday go-to-meeting clothes. That's the way it was for centuries, until a guy came along. Most of you weren't even born yet, so you might look at this and think it was ancient history. There's a few of us that don't remember this guy. I remember him. I think I'm seeing smiles over here from somebody that remembers him. Wendy was a mere baby when he came along. Now, I'm going to read something from his own website. He passed away here just a couple of years ago. In fact, it might have been last year. His name was Chuck Smith, and he started a church in Costa Mesa called Calvary Chapel. Okay, and I'm going to read something from his, because he was the first guy to start dressing down. This is where it came from. In 1965, Pastor Chuck Smith, this is the other thing. This is why I can't stand people calling me Pastor Jim. I've told you that before. It drives me out of my mind because of this guy and others like him. It's like fingernails on a blackboard to me. If you want to call me pastor, that's fine. That's a sign of respect. If you want to call me Pastor Henderson, that's fine. Pastor Jim, to me, is an insult because you're equating me with these other guys. That's just one of my. You look at Pastor Mott. Now, you can call him Ben or you can call him Pastor Mott, but you don't call him Pastor Ben. And Conrad, Wendy and I talked about this. People call him Pastor Conrad, but Conrad's not a nickname. I suppose if you wanted to call me Pastor James, but that now I sound like the guy that's going to drive you home. Home, Pastor James. Right? Conrad, that's not a shortened version. I mean, I don't even know what a nickname would be for Conrad. Connie, I guess? And I dare any of you to call him Pastor Connie and see what happens. Watch that old Marine go ballistic on you on that one. But this is that reason. So if you want to call me pastor, that's great. You want to call me Pastor Henderson in a formal situation, that's fine too. But I just don't like Pastor Jim because of these guys. Because these guys ruined it for us. In 1965, Pastor Chuck Smith started his ministry at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. Beginning with a mere 25 people, he saw God bless his simple yet consistent style of teaching straight through the Bible. Remember, I'm reading this off of his website. Okay. Today, Calvary Chapel draws over 10,000 attendees weekly. You see the word used? They fill the church up with 10,000 attendees. It doesn't say members. It says attendees. 10,000 attendees weekly with a genuine heart for the lost. Pastor Chuck made room in his ministry for a generation of hippies, surfers, and drug addicts. Is that my job? Is it my job to be more concerned? How many people in this room consider themselves lost? How many of you are hell-bound sinners headed to hell on a freight train to hell because you're lost? I don't see any hands. How come? I'm not here to minister to the lost. If I was here to minister to the lost, I'd be out there in the lobby. I'm here to minister to God's children. My heart isn't for the lost. My heart is for the children of God. My job's not to try to populate heaven with a bunch of lost folk that never become anything other than a bunch of lost folk. I've told you my dad was an Archie. Here's one of his sayings: you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. You can't make children of God out of lost people if God doesn't convert them. That's not my job to take care of the lost. My job is to take care of the saved. Like Conrad says, to locate and educate the regenerate. That's our job, to find them and teach them what to do to come into fellowship with God. So why would I want to fill up a church full of a bunch of hippies and drug addicts and tell them, you know what, if you want to show up in your underwear and a wife beater, that's fine, just show up. You see, it's a completely different business model than the Church of God, but that's what Chuck Smith went after. I'll tell you another one. Here's another one. You heard of Rick Warren, right? Most of you have heard of Rick Warren in the purpose-driven church and the purpose-driven life. Well, Rick Warren mocks churches which seem to think that the 1950s was the golden age. That's us, folks. Rick Warren makes fun of churches like ours. Now, I know that there are a lot of people that end up in our churches that come here because they think we're different from what they had when they were a kid. Unfortunately, a lot of people grew up in a Southern Baptist church or a missionary Baptist church or primitive Baptist church or some kind of Baptist church. Ben Mott was one. Grew up in a primitive Baptist church and fought like the Dickens to try to find something else because he didn't want that old-fashioned, old-style kind of religion. And after he went on a world search, he found out, well, okay, that they were right. They might be old-fashioned, but they were right. And that's the problem that a lot of us have to deal with. I was raised a missionary Baptist. And when I'd had my fill of them and I left, the last place I expected to end up would be here. I thought, well, it has to be something different. Because I was looking at the people. I was judging the church based on the people. And there were a lot of hypocrites in that church. And there were a lot of people that weren't all that godly in that church. And so I judged the church based on the people in the church rather than on what the church really was. If you change the people in the church, there's nothing wrong with the church. You see, the church was still God's church. There's a lot of primitive Baptist churches out there that are still God's church. He still considers them His church. There are a lot of missionary Baptist churches out there that He still considers His church. They might be in error, and once you realize that they're in error, He commands you to come out of them and find something that's not as much in error. But that doesn't change the fact that for all we know, a lot of those people could be in heaven. A lot of them may not be, but a lot of them could be. Don't judge the church and what the church does based on bad experiences from the past because the people made you mad. Okay? So Rick Warren mocks those churches. He makes fun of those types of churches. He encourages young pastors to leave behind that old-fashioned church music. You know what that is? The stuff we sang a little while ago called hymns. Leave that stuff off. In favor of jazz or rock or whatever turns your people on. That's what he says. Is that my job, folks? You know how he designed his church? Rick Warren, he explains it in his book. He spent 12 weeks going around knocking on doors asking people, if I could develop the perfect church for you, what would it look like? What do I got to do to get you to sign on the dotted line? What do I have to do to get you into this church? That's what those mega churches are designed to do. Let's go find out what the people want and give it to them. That's not a church. His book should have been called The Market-Driven Church, not The Purpose-Driven Church. That's what he did. He went around and took a bunch of surveys and built a church based on what a bunch of lost people wanted to go to, and let's try to make it look like a party and fill up the room. Now, there's two issues here, and I'm fully aware that probably behind all of this is a desire, because the more people you got in the house, the more money you got in the house. But let's give the guy the benefit of the doubt, and let's say that he's really just trying to save souls. So the more people I get in there, the more I can populate heaven. Okay, but that's not your job. That's not the pastor's job. I'm not here to populate heaven, folks. I'm not here to save lost people. That's God's job. God does that. God does that, and then God brings those children in under our teaching for us to teach them how to be better children of God. Right? I mean, the baby has to get born first, and then we start changing diapers. You don't bring them in and then turn them into babies. That's not how it works. They got to be born first. Then you teach them. So these were the ones. Let me see. Where's my quote here? Oh, here's a good quote. Where Warren began his church, he started out using the very same methodology of Robert Schuller. Remember him? Any of you guys know who Robert Schuller was? And Bill Hybels, there's another one for you. Not surprisingly, Schuller praises the book on the inside front cover. Hybels highlights the book on his church website. And he's spent these 12 weeks going door to door. And so he has a full menu of services for empty nesters. He has a ministry for empty nesters. People like Wendy and me, whose kids are finally out of the house, and they wonder. I guess a lot of people have trouble when the kids leave the house. I don't know why. Blake and Josh, if you're listening, I'm sorry, but I don't know why. Wendy and I are having the time of our lives. And I've talked to Ben Mott and Conrad. We're very happy to be empty. We love it. Are you kidding me? But then we have good marriages, and we didn't base our marriages on our kids. We based our marriages on ourselves. Okay? But he has a ministry for empty nesters, and he has a ministry for this, and a ministry for that, a ministry for something else. That's not God's church. That's not even second cousin to God's church. And so I just want you to understand that church is a place that you should come bringing your best, bringing the best you have to offer to the God that died on a cross to save your miserable soul. He deserves that. And worship means you fall on your face and thank Him in tears. That's the way you should approach God. Something else I want you to... we never got to Ezekiel. Did we ever get to Ezekiel? I think I chased a rabbit here. Did I ever read the verse? Ezekiel chapter 44:30. No, I didn't get... I mentioned it. And I think while you were turning there, I ran down a rail for about an hour and a half. Ezekiel 44:30, and the first of all your first fruits of all things, and every oblation of every sort of your oblation shall be the priest's. You shall also give unto the priest the first of your dough. That doesn't mean money. That's D-O-U-G-H. That's the stuff that you make bread out of. Okay? That he may cause the blessing to rest in thine house. Notice that. By doing that, you cause the blessing to rest in his house. It's his house where you bring this. It's God's order that God's children provide for God's church. It's His rule that has been in place from the very beginning. Okay? Because of this, and a lot of people don't understand this, and they lose sight of this. And I've preached on this a couple of times already in this series, but I may as well hammer the point a little bit more, because I still got 15 minutes. The car that Wendy and I drove to church in this morning, even though the title's in the safety deposit box, the car belongs to God. The furniture that we moved down here from Bakersfield when we moved, that belongs to God. That's His stuff. Every book that I have on a bookshelf belongs to God. The television hanging over the fireplace belongs to God. The clothes that I have on my back belong to God. Everything I have, God gave me for the purpose of doing what I have to do in His kingdom. And what He says is, I want you to give me 10% of it back. It's that simple. That's what it comes down to. Don't lose sight of that. I want you now to turn to Malachi chapter 3, and I'm going to tell another little story, and then I want to show you something, because you see the Jews had lost sight of this. In Malachi's day, they'd lost sight of this, and they thought that the reason that they were wealthy, the reason that they were rich and that they abounded in things was because of their own resourcefulness. They'd lost sight of the fact that it was God blessing them, and that was the reason that they had all the things they had. In Malachi chapter 3 and verse 7, even from the days of your fathers ye are gone away from mine ordinances, and have not kept them. Return unto me, and I will return unto you, saith the Lord of hosts. But you said, wherein shall we return? You see, they didn't even know they'd left. They didn't even realize that they'd turned away and walked away from God. Because they thought it was them. They lost sight of the fact that everything they had was God's. Verse 8, will a man rob God? Now, I want you to think about something for a minute. Pick one of my sons, either one. This side of the room is Josh, and that side of the room is Blake. We'll do it that way, okay? If one of my kids was at the house, and I walked up to him and I handed him a couple of $100 and I said, on this side of the room or on that, whichever, I need you to go down to Lakeland Electric and I need you to pay the power bill because I forgot. And if we don't get it paid, they're going to shut the power off. So I need you to take this money down there and pay the bill today. Otherwise, we're not going to have any power over the weekend. Okay, they're going to turn the power. So here's $200. I don't know how much the bill is, 150, 160, doesn't matter. Here's enough to cover it. Whatever's left over, you can keep. Right? And here's the keys to my car. And it's got gas in it. So go pay the power bill because you're just sitting here watching TV anyway and I'm working. Right? Well, so they get up and leave and take the money and get in the car and drive off and come back a couple hours later with a bag in their hand and a new pair of blue jeans, and they've been gone for quite a while. I don't think anything about it, and the next thing you know, the lights go off. And so I go ask them, did you pay the power bill? And they say, well, you know, I kind of got sidetracked. I bought a pair of jeans, and I went to the movie, and, you know, I went and had lunch with a friend, and then I didn't have enough money left over to pay the power bill with. Is there anyone in this room that would not think that I would be justified in saying that they stole $200 from me? Did they not rob me? Okay, now let's look at the verse. Verse 8, will a man rob God? Remember, everything you own belongs to him. Will a man rob God? Yet ye have robbed me. But ye say, wherein have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings. You see, they weren't paying the temple. They weren't paying the priests. They weren't supporting God's work. Verse 9, ye are cursed with a curse, for ye have robbed me. Just like my kids would have robbed me if I gave them money to do something and they didn't do that and used it on something else. Anytime that God gives you something and you don't do with it what you're supposed to be doing with it, you are stealing from God. Ye are cursed with a curse, for ye have robbed me, even this whole nation. Now, our little system here in this church is different than most. We don't play a bunch of music for a while and get you all worked up and then start passing the hat. We don't pass the plate in front of you so that everybody sees whether you put something in there or not. We don't work that system. We don't have little cards that you fill out. We don't have little envelopes that you put your offering in with your name and your address and your social security number and your phone number on it. We don't issue statements at the end of the year. We have a little box over there, and you go stick your 10% money in the box, and that's it. I don't know who puts money in there, and I don't know who doesn't, and I don't really care. God takes care of me regardless. Okay? Sometimes that box is full like you wouldn't believe, and then other times it's empty. And I don't know what that amounts to, and I don't really care. But what I'm saying to you as individuals here is that for your own sake, be careful with this. God gets serious about it. I have been beaten with a rod over this one until I learned my lesson. My children have been beaten with a rod over this one until they've learned their lesson. Now, we've been Christians for almost 30 years, so you are all fairly new at this. So I'm telling you up front, from the beginning, don't fall into the devil's trap. Because here's what will happen. You will have every intention of following God's order. And then something will happen. A bill will show up that you weren't expecting. Something will show up that you weren't expecting, and then you'll think, well, I have to pay this. But if I pay this, I don't have enough money to give to the church. Well, I'll make it up next week. And so you pay the bill, and you don't take care of God. And then the next week, you forget about it. And then another week goes by and you're starting to get farther and farther behind. And pretty soon it's been a month and a half or 2 months since you've given anything to God, and now all of a sudden the preacher stands up and preaches on it and you start feeling guilty. Then you get mad at the preacher. That's human nature. You get mad at me because I'm preaching on something that just happened to be in the middle of the verse that I have to cover today. Right? And then the next thing you know, you get mad at God and walk off and leave and don't ever come back. Okay? I want you to understand, I'm not doing this to make people feel guilty. And if you feel guilty, it's not my fault. I put my 10% money in the church envelope, and I do it every week. And so does my wife, and so do my kids. We follow this rule. And as a result, God has always taken care of us. Ever since we learned the lesson, He has always taken care of us. Even on those times when we didn't think we could do it, because if we do it, we're going to starve to death, something happened and He took care of us. He always has. Okay? So don't get mad at me about this. I did not write the King James Bible. I know I have the name James, but I'm not the author of that book. I'm just reading it to you. Don't shoot the messenger. Okay? Because I know how hard this is. Trust me, I know how hard this one is. In verse 10, he says, bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house. That's God's house. And prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. You don't believe that I can take care of you? Prove me. Now that's a pretty mighty God to say that. You think I can't take care of you? Try me and see what happens. Prove me and see what happens. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. I'm getting behind on the game here. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So anyway, so let's get back to Elijah again. Elijah says to this woman, "Fear not. Go and do as thou hast said. But make me thereof a little cake first, and bring it unto me, and after make for thee and for thy son." Provide for God first, and then go do with the rest as you see fit. And that's the whole sum of what I just spent an hour pounding the pulpit on. Provide for God first, and then do with the rest as you see fit, and God will take care of you. But you have to be willing to meet that test. Now here's the question, will she do it? Will this widow woman do this? She's down to her last, I gave a lot of thought to this, and I'm thinking, if I'm down to my last meal, it's probably not as hard to give it up as it would be if I had a whole bunch of meals ahead of me. I mean, come on, really? Am I going to be full off of, and so what if I am full? So what if I have one last steak meal and then I starve to death? I may as well start starving to death now. What difference is it going to make? But this was still a test to her. Are you going to hang on with both hands and not give anything back to God? Or are you willing to take the test and pass it? This is a test. If you haven't already figured out, this was a test. Will she believe him? There were times when David lost heart. There were times, David, a man after God's own heart, there were times when he completely and totally lost faith. So in those moments when we completely and totally lose faith, let's not think that that's anything other than just human nature. It happens to all of us. David said in 1 Samuel 27:1, he said in his heart, "I shall now perish one day by the hand of Saul." He thought Saul would kill him. He didn't. And really, he knew better. And all those times that you say to yourself, if I do this, I'm going to starve. No, you're not. You might think you are, but you won't. The children of Israel in the wilderness in Exodus chapter 16 and verse 3, they said to Moses, "Would to God we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, and when we did eat bread to the full, for ye have brought us forth into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Well, did he really? No. Did they die? Well, they died, but they didn't die then. They weren't killed with hunger. As we continue on, we're going to find out that Elijah loses faith. Even this great man of God lost faith. And we're going to see it here in a few chapters. But for right now, we're dealing with this woman. Will she be comforted by what Elijah said when he said, "Fear not"? Will she pass this test? Will she do what he said? Or will she make her last meal for her son and her, and then they'll die? And there's something else I want you to understand. There's a lot of this that what I'm really trying to do when I teach these lessons is not so much to be mean to you, but more to try to comfort you, to try to give you comfort from personal experiences that I have had and from things that I've done, so that you understand that when I stand up here and say this, I'm trying to help you to walk your life in such a way that you have comfort, in such a way that you understand what it is that God wants from you. My heart is not for the lost. My heart is for the people in this room. And I want you to see the better side of things. I want you to see the good side of things. I want you to live a good life. Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 3, "Blessed be the God, even the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforteth us." In context, he's talking about his ministers. "Who comforteth us, his ministers, in all our tribulation, that we, his ministers, may be able to comfort them which are in any trouble," that's you, "by the comfort wherewith we ourselves are comforted of God." The lessons that I've had to learn, I can only assume that you have to go through the same lessons. because we're all humans. We all fall to the same human nature. We all have the same issues. We're all the same in that regard. And so when I have to go through something, and unfortunately your pastor has a very thick noggin, and so it takes me multiple times of going through things until I finally figure it out. And I'm hoping that you guys get through it the first time and don't have to go through it over and over and over and over again. And what I'm trying to do is to comfort you so you know what to do so that you don't fall into that kind of a trap. So Elijah says, "Fear not, for thus saith the Lord God of Israel, the barrel of meal shall not waste, neither shall the cruse of oil fail until the day that the Lord send rain upon the earth." I want you to see something here. I want you to notice how definite this promise was. It wasn't barely that God won't suffer you to starve to death. He didn't say that, right? It was very specific. And it wasn't that you're going to have more than you can ever imagine. It was that you're going to get by and you're going to be fine. Now, it wasn't the type of a thing to where, I look at Elijah and I think, he spent a year by the creek eating nothing but whatever the ravens brought him. Now he's going to eat bread and oil for another couple of years. And the Bible doesn't say he got anything else. His diet wasn't all that different, but he was alive. In Luke chapter 11 and verse 3, in the Lord's Prayer, in Luke's version of the Lord's Prayer, he says, "Give us day by day our daily bread." You see, this barrel, it just never ran out. God didn't fill it to the full. God didn't give her a new barrel. It's just as she scooped it out, it never ran dry. It's kind of, I have a barrel on the counter at the house. It's got coffee beans in it. Unfortunately, my barrel of coffee beans runs dry from time to time. I got to go to the store and get another bag to fill the barrel up with. I would love to have one of those that never runs dry, because it always seems to run dry at 6 o'clock in the morning when I could really use a cup of coffee, and I don't have enough to make a pot. But that's what he's talking about. The barrel just won't run dry. For the whole, would you be willing to do that? You're down to your last meal and I eat this and I die. Or if I make this prophet a cake and provide for him, I'll get through all of this? When everyone else around me is starving to death, I'll get by because I put God first? I think it's a pretty good deal. So in 1 Kings 17:15, we get the answer to the question of what she was going to do. And it said, "And she went and did according to the saying of Elijah. And she and he and her house did eat many days." Does that not make you want to stand on the rooftops and shout, "Oh, woman, great is thy faith"? There's another woman from this area, from the same area. Turn to Matthew chapter 15. There's another woman from this same Phoenician area that reminds me of this. Matthew chapter 15, verse 21. Then Jesus went thence and departed into the coasts of Tyre and Sidon, and behold, a woman of Canaan came out of the same coasts, and cried unto him, saying, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, thou son of David. My daughter is grievously vexed with a devil." But he answered her not a word. That doesn't sound like the Jesus of the world, does it? He didn't even answer her. And his disciples came and besought him, saying, "Send her away, for she crieth after us. She's bugging us. Can you tell her to get lost?" But he answered and said, "I'm not sent but unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I'm not sent to these Gentiles." Then she came and worshipped him, saying, "Lord, help me." But he answered and said, "It is not meet to take the children's bread and to cast it to the dogs." You know, there's a lot of people be insulted by that. He just called this woman a dog. Right? He just called her a dog. I know people that would take issue with that and stand up and get in an argument with him. It's not meet for me to cast the children's bread unto dogs. And she said, "Truth, Lord, yeah, I'm a dog. I'll admit I'm a dog." Yet the dogs eat of the crumbs which fall from their master's table. You see, even dogs get fed. Then Jesus answered and said unto her, "O woman, great is thy faith. Be it unto thee even as thou wilt." And her daughter was made whole from that very hour. Over in Luke 17:5, the apostles cried unto Christ and said, "Lord, increase our faith." And that's what we need to do day by day by day. Be like this woman and cry unto God, "Lord, increase our faith." Because none but he that bestows faith can increase it. You don't have faith because you have it of yourself. You have faith because God gave it to you. And the only way you can increase it is to ask for it. James said, "Ye have not because ye ask not." You ask him to increase your faith. And you take steps necessary to increase your faith. And your faith will increase to the point that you can move mountains. Pink said she was no loser by her generosity. Her little supply of meal and oil was but sufficient for a single meal, and then she and her son must die. But her willingness to minister unto God's servant brought her sufficient not only for many days, but until the famine ended. So she gave Elijah of the best she had, and for her kindness to him, God kept her household supplied throughout the famine. And this is what Jesus made reference to over in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 41. When he said, "He that receiveth a prophet in the name of a prophet shall receive a prophet's reward." And this poor widow woman received the prophet Elijah and received a prophet's reward. And so in 1 Kings 17:5, she went and did according to the saying of Elijah, and she and he and her house did eat many days, and the barrel of meal wasted not, neither did the cruse of oil fail. Throughout the entire famine, they got by. They were sustained. Now think about this. You have a famine in a land, nobody has anything to eat. Nobody has any food. Probably the worst thing in the world God could have done was to give her a garage full of food, because somebody would come and steal it. All she's got is just a little barrel, a little bit in the bottom of a barrel. It's just that little bit in the bottom of the barrel never ends, never goes away. It may not be fancy, but it's enough to get them through. And here again we've exemplified the fact that receiving of God's blessing and obtaining food, both literal and spiritual. Remember, we have two sides to the coin. We're not just talking about physical here. We're talking about spiritual food as well. Not just the physical stuff, but the spiritual stuff. You want to know more and more about God, then you do what God says and you will learn more and more about God. So don't think that I'm only talking about the physical realm. This is also applicable to the spiritual realm. That's important to note. And they're both conditioned on obedience. Psalm 34:9 says, "O fear the Lord, ye his saints, for there is no want to them that fear him." And remember, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And if you fear the Lord, you keep his commandments. That's what you do. That's how you know that you fear God, you do what God said. In Psalm 84, verse 11, it says, "For the Lord God is a sun and a shield. The Lord will give grace and glory. No good thing will he withhold from them that walk uprightly." It doesn't say no good thing will he withhold to anybody. It says to them that walk uprightly, to them that keep his commandments. Notice both of those promises are conditional. You have to do what God says in order to get the benefit that God gives. Your eternal salvation is something that comes free. You don't have to worry about that. If you're a child of God, you have no fear of ever losing that salvation. You will have that forever. When you die, you won't even lose consciousness, and you will immediately be transported into the glory of God. That you didn't have to pay for. That was free. That was grace. But in this life, the blessings we get, we earn. We get some of them. And, you know, this is one of those cases where the more, unfortunately, the more you know, the harder you got to work. I remember when I first became a real estate appraiser years ago, it didn't take me long to figure out that if I was going to be a professional, I couldn't make as much money as if I was a flake. The flakes make more money than the pros do in some cases. Because every time I would take a class, I would realize I have to do that too. I never knew I had to do that. Now I have to do that. And it kept piling on. Every class, oh, there's something else you have to do, and there's that I didn't know about before. Well, now I got to put more work into every assignment than I do. What's the same way? It's the same way here. It's the same way in the Christian life. The more you know, the more you're responsible for. The more you learn, the more you're responsible for. Now, the goal is to get to learn a lot. But understand that you're responsible for a lot. That's why the Bible says that there are not many masters, because they receive, what's the verse? Mind went blank for a second. My brethren, be not many masters, knowing that we shall receive the greater condemnation. The more you know, the more you're responsible for. So you might be able to do something and get away with it, that if I did the same thing, I get whacked. Right? It's just like your children. It's the same way. As your children grow up, you expect more from them. And so when you don't expect a 2-year-old to know what to do with, like you would have. I have to cut out the teenage years because they go brain dead when they turn 13 until they're about 20 again. But maybe 9. Maybe you don't expect a 2-year-old to know what a 9-year-old would know. And so you hold a 9-year-old a little bit more responsible than a 2-year-old, you would think. It's the same way here. 1 Kings 17:5, and she went and did according to the saying of Elijah, and she and he and her house did eat many days. And I've already mentioned the fact that the menu, we don't see that the menu changed much. The Apostle Paul said in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 8, and having food and raiment, let us be therewith content. The diet might not change. There might be times when when you don't get a steak all the time, when the diet doesn't change that much. You might have those times. You might have those times when you have to go for 2 years eating nothing but meal out of a barrel with a little bit of oil. But you'll get through it if you're obedient to God to do what God asks you to do. In Philippians 4:11, Paul said, not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content. But notice something. He had to learn that. He learned that whatsoever state he was in, he therewith to be content. That was something Paul had to learn, something I had to learn, something that we all have to learn. We have to learn that. And the sooner we learn the lesson, the better things are going to be. And you have to ask the question, how do you get to be an apostle? How do you get to do that? How do you get to the point that you can be like the Apostle Paul and be content? How do you get there? It takes a submissive and a peaceful heart that rests in God. Knowing that God is not going to let you fall on your face. Knowing that He's going to be there. Knowing that He's going to always provide. But that everything that you do is subject to Him. If you realize that, if you realize that you're God's possession and you're here to serve Him, then you can gain a submissive and a content heart. Because you realize that everything you do glorifies God, or should. And so the barrel of meal wasted not, and neither did the cruse of oil fail. And you think about the woman, I mean, she really didn't have anything to complain about here. I would hope that you wouldn't complain. She ended up with a prophet Elijah to live with for 2 years. How would that be? One meal. She gives the guy one meal, and she ends up with Elijah in her house for 2 years to teach her for one meal. And while everybody else around her is starving to death, she's got food. Hebrews 6 and verse 10 says, "For God is not unrighteous to forget your work and labor of love which ye have showed toward His name, in that ye have ministered to the saints," and do minister. Anytime you're faithful to God, God doesn't forget it. He's not unrighteous to forget that. And He didn't forget this woman. And so the barrel never wasted. Now we spent a lot of time looking at the physical side of this, and I really wanted to get into the spiritual side, but I don't have enough time this morning to get there. But we'll get into that next week, because there is an actual spiritual side to this barrel of meal and this oil. There are pictures in this from the spiritual aspects of what this barrel of meal and what this oil represents. But I'm just not going to have, I don't want to even start into this now with 10 minutes left and leave it hanging. There's too much here. So when we come back next week, we'll pick up there and move forward. And so for this morning, I'll ask the Lord to add His blessing to His word. And let's stand and be dismissed with prayer.